All right. Welcome everyone to another lunch lecture. Well, not lunch lecture anymore, but rather a lecture talk stream from Space Society 20.
All right.
We are happy
Everyone
that
to another
you are all here
lunch.
with us. And we hope that you will have a nice stream, a nice evening, and learn something new for yourself. So today we have with us Arno Wielders, a spaceflight expert, who will talk to us about colonizing Mars, which is a very exciting topic given the recent advancements in SpaceX technology and general hype about Mars. If you have any questions during the live stream, please drop the questions in the live chat that you should see under the video or to the side of the video, and we will answer those questions in our Q&A session. So with that in mind, Arno, take it away.
Igor, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really happy to talk about Mars again. It has been a while, I must say. So yes, my name is Arno Wielders. I've been one of the founders of MarsOne, which was, I have to be absolutely clear here, which was the company trying to set people on Mars on a one-way trip. So really placing a settlement on the red planet and starting to increase the amount of people there. So what I will do is I will go a little bit through the history of spaceflight, at least from the beginning as I see it, what makes the prospect of living outside the Earth much more recent, I think, than what you could have expected 20 years ago. So things are accelerating, and that has a point in time, from my point of view, where it started. So I'd like to go there. So maybe you're old enough to remember this beautiful spaceship, which is, of course, the Space Shuttle. However, the Space Shuttle is also a machine which basically hampered a little bit the exploration of space. And I will come to that a little bit later. So the original idea of the Space Shuttle was that it would have to fly 50 times per year. Now, we all know that in the end, the Space Shuttle flew only 6 or 7 times per year. So something went wrong in the design phase and in the operational phase of the spacecraft. And basically, since 1981, the US has been looking into trying to retire it. And in the end, after 2 major incidents with the space shuttles, they have put the whole ship in retirement in 2012. And then everybody thought, okay, what should we do now? So what happened is that in 2004, there was a group of people in the X Prize, and maybe you've heard about this. This is a foundation in the US, and what they're basically trying to do is to put grant prizes in the system, and you can earn them by accomplishing a major feat. And one of the space flight X Prizes was that you should be able to put a group of people, 2 to 3 people, higher than 100 kilometers, and use the same system again 2 weeks later. Now, nobody thought that that would be feasible, but there was one guy, Bert Rutan, and he thought it was. So he built a spacecraft design, and in the end, it was only 1 pilot going up, but they were able to accomplish this feat and put Spaceship One in space. And 2 weeks later, they were able to put the same spacecraft at the same altitude again. So they won the prize, which was a major accomplishment, not only from the fact that it was not an institutional accomplishment, but it was really private enterprise doing this. So that basically set the stage for a couple of things. First of all, at the end of the X Prize, the moment the prize was won, Richard Branson came in from Virgin and basically bought the whole scheme. So this was already something which a lot of people surprised, because most people thought that space flight would never become a private enterprise. So this was the start of it, and yeah, the rest is history, I would say. So Virgin Galactic has been building this spacecraft 2 system for the last 15 years. So they had a lot of delays. They had a couple of incidents, even one accident where 1 pilot lost his life. But now they're very close to accomplishing the first passenger flight, which I think they will do before the end of this year. And what I know is that there are some rumors that Richard Branson is going to be on that flight as well. So they are becoming much more reliable in the system. They trust the system more, it becomes more reliable, but it has been a long way after 2004 before this system really came online. Now, what does this mean? Well, with this spacecraft, which consists of two parts, you've got the mothership, and you've got the actual spacecraft. So the mothership brings it to 12 to 13 kilometers in altitude, drops the spacecraft, and then goes straight up to around 100 kilometers in the end, and then it glides down on a normal runway. And 6 passengers can go at one time, and there are 2 pilots, and there's one accompanying crew to make sure that everybody stays within the seat. See it like a flight attendant. Now, this spacecraft should really become operational at the end of this year. Luckily, they're not the only one. So there are many people more, but one of the other aspects which is really important, if you look into the further accomplishment in space, is of course the International Space Station. And there are a number of reasons why the International Space Station is important. One of the things is that with the space station, we really started to learn how to live in microgravity. So we know from previous spaceflight experiences from the Russians in the 70s of the last century that space flight has a severe impact on the human body. We talk about osteoporosis, muscle fatigues, and overall issues on even the brain, eye. There are a lot of issues which are affecting the human body when you're not in 1G anymore. So with the ISS, which is already flying for quite a long time now, people are able to basically assess the effect of microgravity on the human body on a long duration. Because when we're going to Mars, the one-way trip is already 7 to 8 months. So you have to learn and you have to adapt the human behavior, but also the human body, such that you can withstand those kind of long durations. Furthermore, we learn to do spacewalks. This is an important thing as well. If your spacecraft on the way to Mars breaks down partly, you have to go outside and you have to be able to repair the ship. So how to perform a spacewalk, how to operate a spacesuit, how to operate all kinds of equipment, that's what people are currently learning on the ISS. So it's a very important stepping stone towards people living beyond low Earth orbit. Now, after, I think almost a year after Spaceship One flew in 2005, it became apparent that there was another small company starting up, and it was called Space Exploration Technologies. And there was one very strange guy leading it, and the guy was named Elon Musk. And nobody had heard of him. People knew a little bit that he had kind of software company, which he sold around that time. And he basically did 2 things. He put half of his money into a rocket company and the other half in a car company. And the idea behind SpaceX was that he wanted people to go to Mars, but on a grand scale. So when he analyzed the problem, he found that there is one key problem in making these kind of missions a reality. And that's basically the cost per kilogram to bring stuff in space. So if you look into launches like the Atlas V, but also Ariane 5 from Arianespace here in Europe, the launch costs are relatively high. So it costs a lot of money to bring stuff in space. So the equipment you bring in space needs to be really reliable, and that brings additional costs to that as well. So when he thought about creating a new kind of rocket, he had the idea of reusability already in mind. And he basically started the design of the rocket having this key principle of reusability taking into account. Now, there is a very good book about all the adventures of the early years of SpaceX, which is called Liftoff, written by Eric Berger. And there you really read what kind of problems he had having the first Falcon 1, getting it into orbit, which only occurred after the fourth launch, and switching very rapidly into Falcon 9, which is currently the workhorse of SpaceX. But what he basically did was something what other space companies or launch companies were not doing. And he was using actual launches to try new technology. And he was not afraid to fail. And this is one of the mantras of NASA, of course, is that failure is not an option. And for Musk, it's the other way around. Failure must be an option. And you must fail because otherwise you don't learn. And he has failed a couple of times. And I think he learned a lot of that. And with that respect, he was able to develop Falcon 9, which was basically bought by NASA in the late 2008 to be used as, together with the Dragon space capsule, to bring cargo to the ISS and later to bring people to the ISS. So yeah, you have to be aware that this is a different kind of procurement scheme. So normally NASA is leading the development of a rocket, like the Space Launch Rocket, which NASA is now developing to go to the moon. This is a rocket which is mainly developed by NASA. While when they procured the launches to go to the ISS with Falcon 9, but also with the other company called Northrop Grumman with the Antares rocket, they basically said, we only buy the ticket. We don't buy the equipment, we only buy the ride. And this has a major difference for NASA. It's much cheaper. But not only that, it gives the companies also the ability to attract different customers. And that's basically what's happening right now. Is you see, when people talk about the commercialization of space, which is really important if you want to do ground things in space, you need to have different customers than the normal agencies like NASA, ESA, or Roscosmos in Russia. So you need to be able to attract customers who see a business case in bringing people into space. And there's now one company called Axiom Space, and they have already signed up for 3 to 4 flights with Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon to bring people into space and to the ISS and to perform all kinds of experiments. So slowly but certainly there's a market created where people think they can earn quite some money by doing space flight, which 10 years ago was deemed to be impossible. So things have changed a lot. Now, together with Falcon 9, they've also developed basically the Falcon Heavy, which is a beast of a rocket with 3 Falcon 9 cores, 27 engines. And this is basically the forerunner of the ground spacecraft they're currently building, which is called Spaceship, or Starship even. These are just a number of pictures where you show the reusability. Yeah? So Musk said that it's crazy to use a rocket once and then throw it completely away. It's like buying a ticket to go to New York, and after you've landed, the plane is being scrapped. And he's right. So what he did is he tried to first recover the first stage of the rocket, which is around 75% of the total cost of building the rocket. And he was able to, after a couple of failures, he was able to bring that back. And he has done that now already 80 times, 80. 80 times bringing a first stage back. Some of those first stages have been used for almost 10 times. So you can imagine the cost saving he's able to implement to ensure that the launch cost in total becomes much lower. And that's exactly the way we should be going. Now, there are different other companies basically set up after SpaceX became successful, ex-employees of SpaceX starting new companies, and they're basically going for the same design, maybe a little bit different with 3D printing, but making the rocket completely reusable. And that's the key. Now, this is the famous Starship, which SpaceX is developing, and this is the spacecraft which should be able to bring people to the moon, but also to Mars. This is the actual spacecraft will bring you there. Now, they are developing this at the moment in a small place in Texas called Boca Chica. They've built a huge facility there. They're currently building the launch tower for this whole system, which is huge, because this booster has a diameter of around 10 meters. The lower part of the booster will have 27 to 31 Raptor engines. So can you imagine a rocket launch with 27 engines? This is going to be major. And the Starship itself has already flown a couple of times, already at least some prototypes, and they've done all kinds of maneuvers to see how stable it is during the flight and also during return, because the whole system needs to be reusable to make sure that the launch cost of the whole thing becomes only the cost of propellant, which is interesting, because when you're able to, there are a couple of things happening the moment you are able to reduce launch costs such that the actual payload you're going to fly is the major contributing factor. But if that's the case, then you can also design your satellite or the equipment you want to fly in space with a little bit more risk in mind, because if the launch goes, or if the satellite fails in orbit, the launch was not that expensive. The build was also not that expensive. So the amount of evolution you can get in getting more and more technologies on board in your satellite can be accelerated. And that's exactly what we're looking at. If you now look, for example, to the central computer of the ISS, this is a computer which was used in the late 90s of last century. But it takes 10 to 15 years to make a computer radiation hardened, and to make sure that it's reliable enough that it can be used in space. So if you're able to reduce the launch cost significantly, then you start to be able to do stuff much more faster. The developments can be much faster. Your ability to put new technology into your spacecraft or in your satellite becomes much better. So all these elements make the acceleration of things happening in space much higher. It's important to remember. Now, there's another guy who has a lot of money, which is of course Jeff Bezos. He's got his own company as well called Blue Origin. He will probably fly himself around the 4th of July in a couple of weeks on a new Shepard launch to around 100 kilometers in altitude, showcasing his passenger flight capability. But again, this only goes to 100 kilometers in altitude, which is basically the edge of space, does not go into orbit around the Earth, and then returns safely, hopefully, on the same spot where he launched from. But this is becoming also a commercial passenger flight. So being able to bring people to the edge of space and bring them back within an hour time frame. It's a nice story to tell on a birthday, yeah. So it's something new. So a lot of people are signing up for it, even though the cost associated with it is relatively high, I would say. So on the first flight of New Shepard, Jeff Bezos will fly, and just recently they auctioned off one of the leftover seats, and the person buying it paid $28 million to fly on this flight. So there's a lot of interest, and apparently money to be made as well, which is important. Because you cannot come up with a commercial activity in space without earning money, because then nobody will fund you. Very important. Now, we've talked about the launchers, which are really important because they lower the cost of bringing stuff into space. But now we have to think about living in space as well. Now, we have already quite some history. If you look to space stations like Skylab from the US in the 70s, 80s of the last century, Mir space station from Russia. But now we have two space stations in orbit. We have one which is called the ISS, but there's also a Chinese space station, and which is currently inhabited by 3 astronauts from China. So that's going into the right direction. Living in space, doing it for a longer amount of time, not just a week, but maybe a year, maybe even 2 years. See how that works. You see other companies coming up, having ideas. This is, for example, an idea which came around in the 90s of last century, Bigelow Aerospace, a large owner of a hotel chain. He was willing to put a lot of money into what they call TransHab, which was a design of an inflatable structure to create living and working space in low Earth orbit. And they went quite far, because what they did is they were able to launch one of their prototypes towards the ISS, and it's still connected and it's still inflated. So it's a quite successful project, although the company has more or less disappeared from the arena, but the actual habitat is still there. But this was the idea of a large habitat where 7 to 8 people could live in much more roomy conditions than in the ISS. But you see all kinds of equipment which you have to take on board. There are storage bags for all kinds of experiments, but also for food, for water. You have to bring everything to get up there. You need to have long-term storage with spare parts. You need personal quarters, so astronauts can basically go back in their own space, not being bothered by others, to make sure that they're psychologically, they keep themselves sane. You need to have a kitchen. Food is really important. And this was already learned in the 17th century, when people like Fridtjof Nansen went to the Arctic and stayed there on a ship for 2 to 3 years. And he knew that keeping the crew happy meant that you needed to have good food and good drinks and good cigars even. So he spent quite some effort in making sure that the morale of the crew was well thought of. And this is something which will become an issue in long duration spaceflight as well. So you have to make sure that you have some entertainment. Things could end up a bit boring sometimes. So you're in space and you talk about boring. Can it be? Well, maybe it can. So you have to make sure that people stay happy, and you have to give them some entertainment. You have to give them a window, which is important as well, because they want to look at the Earth and they want to look at the sun. One of the most favorite positions in the ISS is the cupola, which is basically this window area where you can look down on the Earth, and astronauts almost fight for a spot on it to look at the Earth. So that all these kinds of things are important. And then we talk about the physical things which are needed. You need to generate power. But you also need to get rid of the heat generated by these power systems. So you've got solar rays, but you also got radiators to get rid of all the heat. So you have to think about that. Maybe you followed it this week, but they just launched with SpaceX a new set of solar arrays for the International Space Station, and they are now installing them on the ISS. And it's if you see what needs to be done for a spacewalk for 2 people, and then they need to place everything in the right order, and then have to unfold the solar arrays. Many things can go wrong. So there are all kinds of procedures to ensure that it goes properly. So those are the things you have to take into account. And then there are things needed like how do you repair stuff? How do you make it modular so that it's easily replaced? So all these kind of things need to be thought of before you put something into space. Now I have to make a little bit of a side tour here, because one of the reasons why Musk thinks he's able to bring people to Mars within a 10-year time frame is that he thinks that with his overall satellite program called Starlink, he will be able to generate so much money that he can basically afford the mission by himself. So maybe you've heard about this, is the Starlink program, where he wants to put in the order of at least 12,000 satellites in Earth orbit, giving the whole planet internet. Now you can already buy it yourself. There's a small antenna you need to procure from SpaceX, and then the subscription is around 100 euros a month, so it's not cheap, and it doesn't always work. It's still in beta mode, but slowly but certainly more and more satellites are being launched, and I think this will in the end generate enough money for him to do it. So it's important to see that. It has a large amount of side effects as well, of course, so many satellites. We're talking about pollution, of course, orbits being crowded with too many spacecraft, potential collisions in space, which could create clouds of debris. So there's, together with all this kind of activity, there needs to be a good regulation in place to make sure that everybody behaves properly and trash is really being trashed and not being left in orbit and creating harm for other satellites. Now, let's talk a little bit about Mars. So in 2011, together with a colleague of mine, we set up MarsOne. The idea behind this company was that we really wanted to bring 4 people to Mars around 2032. And that would be the start of a settlement on Mars. So it would not be just a one-shot program. The idea was that every 2 years we sent 4 more humans to the surface of Mars. And we would not get them back. So crazy, of course, eh? Crazy. That's what people said. And maybe they were right. But slowly but certainly, some people started to think that it was not that crazy at all. And that if you really want to create a settlement on Mars, you have to focus on creating the settlement and not on creating the capability of bringing people back again. So the company has existed from 2011 until last year, where basically in the end, we were not able to generate the funding required to perform what we wanted to do. And the MarsOne basically ceased to exist. But in the last 10 years, we've learned a lot, and not only from what you need to bring people to Mars, but also what is the actual funding scheme required? How are investors behaving? What kind of people do you need to make a settlement on Mars? So one of the things we did very early in the process is we started an application program. So everybody on Earth could apply for a seat to go to Mars. And I remember quite well when we opened this up, and it was somewhere in the middle of the night, and immediately all the servers, and we already took into account that we would generate quite some traffic. So we hired a large company in the Netherlands to host the website, but still it went almost dark, just by the amount of traffic of people on Earth trying to understand what we were trying to do. So we got a huge amount of applications, which of course in the beginning is very easy to weed through, because you can quickly see who is serious and who is not that serious and sees it more like a joke, which can we understand as well. So we, in the end, 4 or 5 years later, we ended up with 40 people after the whole selection process. And the funny thing is I met quite a lot of those. And people always ask me, well, what kind of people would apply for a one-way trip to Mars? And I always have to think, but after meeting a couple of them, I started to understand where they're coming from. These are people who have been thinking about this already when they were born. So when they were 6, 7 years old, they already had the idea of doing something pioneering and even jeopardizing their own lives for it, because what we made clear from the beginning that this would be a very risky mission. The chances of success would not be that high, but that never bothered most of those people. So and I must admit that I don't have that mindset. But those people do have it, and I see them a little bit like the pioneering spirit from the past, where people really were consciously endangering their own life to do something and to do something positively. So those people were still there a couple of years ago, and some of them have been using their MarsOne fame by getting other jobs. I think in most cases, if I look back to it, it has been a positive experience for most of them. But unfortunately, we were not able to push through. However, the idea of having people on Mars around 2032 is not a pipe dream, not at all. If you see now how Elon Musk with SpaceX is developing, Jeff Bezos developing its own systems as well. But you also see the reaction of the original space flight programs like NASA and ESA. The development of the new rocket in Europe called Ariane 5 or Ariane 6 is basically a response on what Elon Musk is doing. And the Director General of ESA has already said that this was the case. So they needed to develop a new rocket to be more cost effective. Otherwise, they would not make a chance on the commercial market, launching communication or other kind of satellites in space. So what they call the new space companies like SpaceX, like Blue Origin, has a profound effect on what NASA and ESA are trying to achieve as well. Now, what we have to go a little bit back, because Mars might be for NASA and ESA a bit one step too far at this moment. So what NASA is currently doing is they're looking at a return to the moon. And they opened up their whole procurement scheme for all kinds of companies. And they're basically having the same kind of scheme in mind, where they're not buying the actual systems. No, they're only buying the right to the moon. So the actual landing systems, the spacecraft itself, the launcher, they will all remain propriety of the companies developing it. And only NASA buys in the end the taxi ride to the moon. Now, maybe you've heard about this, but half a year ago, it was announced that NASA would give SpaceX the sole task of creating this lunar lander and bringing people back to the moon. Now, this has been contested by Jeff Bezos because he was thinking of getting the money from NASA as well to develop these systems. So we see a lot of developments going on in actually building landing systems for the moon, but also building the systems for humans to stay on the moon for a longer duration. If you look back to the Apollo timeframe, people stayed on the moon for 3 days, maybe 5, but that was it. What they're now looking at is many weeks, maybe months, maybe even a year. So the systems you need to survive on the moon have to be different from those systems in the early timeframes. So you see a lot of development going on in the US, but also here in Europe and in Japan and in Russia as well, and China, on how people should be able to live on another surface body in 10 years from now. Very important. Now, one of the reasons why we thought it would be possible to bring people to Mars is that we were not giving them the return flight. And people made funny remarks on this, but it is a major thing. Huh? Launching a rocket from the surface of the Earth is already quite a feat, but now trying to launch something from the surface of another planet where you don't have any access to is something of an additional feat. So many people have estimated the cost of bringing people to Mars, including a return trip, and a lot of money needs to be spent on the actual rocket development of launching from the surface of Mars. Then your launch cost and your overall cost for the project drops significantly. So that was also one of the reasons why we thought, okay, if you want to do it efficiently and you want to create a settlement, then you don't bring them back. Let's see. Yes. Another couple of reasons why we thought that it would be feasible to do it in a reasonable time frame is the development of commercial rockets. So we would not develop our own rocket, we would just buy a right, and we would develop only the spacecraft going from Earth to Mars and the landing system. Secondly, we know how to live in space. And we have the International Space Station. A lot of research has been done. There are still some issues to be resolved, but we were convinced that we would be able to resolve those issues, like the effects of microgravity on the human body, within the development time of the whole mission, say 12 years. So already now we see countermeasures being put in place for astronauts. So they do a lot of training on board the ISS, but they also have devices making sure that their muscle atrophy is not that high when they return. And the other thing is that we have a lot of prospecting on the surface of Mars as well. We have the Perseverance rover looking into all kinds of surface features. We have Curiosity, but in orbit around Mars, we have quite some spacecraft basically mapping the whole planet. And I think many scientists have already said that if you look to the surface of Mars, I think we know more about that than of the ocean's bottom of the bottom of the ocean on Earth. So we know quite a lot on Mars. And the last element, which has always been one of the key factors of bringing stuff to Mars, is of course entry, descent, and landing. And the funny thing here is that if you look to the physical circumstances where you have to land on Mars, which is in an atmosphere with low pressure, with low temperature, that is almost similar to what the first stage of SpaceX launcher is experiencing when it returns back to Earth. So a lot of those systems developed for returning the first stage were going to be implemented in going to the Mars. And you see that now in the Starship development actually taking place. So the four critical elements of bringing people to Mars, except from all the systems you need on the surface of Mars to keep people alive, were already more or less in place. Now, there are a number of elements when you bring people to the surface of Mars. And what is not always taken into account by a lot of people, like engineers mostly focus, of course, on the technical part, but you have to think about the psychological part as well. So when you're on Mars, you will not see the Earth. Yeah, maybe as a star, but that's it. You cannot directly communicate to Earth because it will take 20 minutes before your radio signal containing your message is received on Earth. So there's no direct communication possible. Sleep is a little bit different because it's not completely a 24-hour period on Mars. It's a little bit more. How are you going to organize the crew? Do you have a democratic style leadership or more like a dictatorship leadership? Does it change in certain circumstances? You don't know. How does the group interact with each other? Important. Workload. This is something which is that there has been circumstances in low Earth orbits, like on Mir space station, but also on the ISS, that astronauts were complaining to the ground that they were given too much work to do, and that the ground did not really appreciate what they were trying to achieve. So this is important as well. How much work do you give people such that they're not overloaded? Important. You have to give them recreation. Medical care. What do you do in a medical emergency? What kind of medical equipment do you take along, and what don't you take along, because you cannot bring a whole hospital with you. So there are all kinds of decisions being taken. Now, food and cooking I've already discussed, and crew selection is a very important thing, of course. And then we talk about equipment. So the thing is that when you go to Mars, you cannot bring everything with you. So you have to live off the land, as they say. You have to be able to generate oxygen out of water, which is on Mars available, but it's below the surface, and it's locked up in ice. So you need to have equipment mining equipment more or less, being able to extract the ice, create water, and create oxygen out of it. But you need to do much more. You need to make sure that there is enough power. So what do you bring along? Solar arrays? I don't think so. Needs to be nuclear, so you need to put a nuclear power station on the surface of Mars. These are all elements which have to be brought along. Another important thing is radiation. I hear that so many times, that you cannot go to Mars because the radiation environment will kill you within one day. Well, they actually measured it on Mars, they measured it in Mars orbit, they measured it on the ISS, and what do we see is that radiation is important to shield yourself from, but it's not a killer. And you have to make sure that on your spacecraft to Mars, but also on Mars itself, because it doesn't have a magnetic field, so you cannot shield the planet from radiation impacting the surface, you have to have shielding places where you can hide when there's, for example, a large solar flare coming your way. So all these kinds of things like radiation, of course, you have to take things into account. You have to design for it, but there are no showstoppers. And this has been, but it has been contested by a lot of people. But we now have the actual measurements, and it's something which we can take care of. Now this is when MarsOne was still operating full steam ahead. This was basically the thing we had in mind. So we wanted to start crew training in 2020, then showcasing what we could do with a lander and a communication satellite around on Mars, do a rover mission to scout the place where we wanted to put the actual base, have cargo missions to bring stuff to the planet, and making sure that all the systems which you need to bring people to Mars were already fully tested with cargo, so no lives were lost if something went wrong. Then we would create on the surface a 80% operational outpost, not with people, but by clever robotic implementation. And only then, when we would be convinced that the outpost would be operational for 80 to 90%, only then would we allow the departure of the crew for the first landing on the planet. So in a nutshell, that's something what we tried to do. So it was not just one go, bring people immediately there. It was, when we discussed this with people from ESA and NASA, they of course, they thought that they could never say in public that a one-way trip would be a good thing to do, but they were not that critical when we talked privately to them. So I will skip a little bit on what we would try to achieve. So this is a potential lander. We even had already some payloads we could put on the lander to showcase that indeed MarsOne was able to bring stuff to the surface of the red planet. This rover mission would go there just to look around the place where we thought that the base would be needed, taking ground penetrating radar to look at what kind of ice-bearing layers would be below it, so that we would have enough water to recover from the subsurface. And then cargo missions with the same spacecraft as we would bring people to the surface of Mars. And then in the end, you would have an operational base. And this base was modular, so you could make it as big as you wanted with the actual landing equipment. Now, this was just a conceptual design, of course. I'm convinced that if we would have found the funding, things would have looked different in the end, but here you go. So we would make use of not only fixed capsules, but also inflatable structures to increase the living area of the people on Mars. And we would protect that by regolith against radiation. Let's see, because yes. So with all these kind of technical elements and psychological elements, there are also legal issues if you want to go to Mars. So one of the things is ownership. Who owns the resources? Who owns the infrastructure? This is not clear. And legal infrastructure needs to be put in place before people go. There is a liability. It's currently the case that if you launch something from, for example, we have a launch pad here in the Netherlands. And one company launches and the rocket drops in Belgium and creates some damage there. Then it's the Dutch government who needs to pay the Belgians for the damage being done. So what the country does, it asks from the company an insurance and needs to prove that they're able and worth a license to launch. Then there's something called planetary protection. Especially for Mars, it's an important thing because scientists think that Mars is in the past was quite Earth-like. So could life have developed on Mars? This is very interesting. So you want to understand and you want to learn and you want to study this. But to do that, you don't want to bring any Earth material or Earth organisms to Mars, which would then spread and maybe give you a false detection if you want to look for Mars life. So there are very strict laws on planetary protection, on how clean your spacecraft needs to be before you're able to launch to Mars. So all kinds of rules needs to be taken into account. You need to basically bake out your complete spacecraft before you send it to Mars to ensure that the amount of biological material and the amount of spores is reduced to a minimum. And then you need to, of course, apply law, national or international law, sea law. There are all kinds of issues. So these were elements which were being discussed as well. This is one of my favorite images. If you then say that you're able to bring a couple of people to Mars and then you want to be a little bit self-sufficient. Well, in the early years, you will never be completely self-sufficient, but how could you try to become as less dependent from the Earth as possible? So one thing is to grow your own food. So this is a possibility. If you use the right kind of material, which still allows normal light to go through, but it saves radiation, it blocks part of the radiation, then you could develop and generate your own vegetables. But you also need to be able to generate air from water, as we discussed before. You need to generate fuel for your rovers and stuff like that. So you need to build quite an infrastructure on Mars before you can even think of becoming self-reliant. And especially for more complicated structures like computer chips and stuff like that, you will become for a long time dependent on what's being generated on Earth. But this is basically the next step. And if you then go further, then you could even think of something what people call terraforming. So Mars now has an atmosphere of around 6 to 8 millibars, average temperature on the surface, minus 80 degrees Celsius. The largest constituent of the atmosphere is CO2. So that's it's not really very Earth-like at the moment. But people have been thinking already for quite some time on what would you need to do to make Mars more Earth-like. Can you create a more thick atmosphere, making sure that water stays liquid on the surface and does not evaporate immediately? Well, people have been thinking about this, generating equipment, building basically large factories to put stuff in the atmosphere. Basically what we're doing uncontrolled in the Earth atmosphere at the moment with our CO2 emissions. But there on Mars, if you want to do it, you have to do it in a very controllable way. So I don't think that this will be happening in the next 50 to 60 years, but maybe in 100 to 200 years, this would be feasible. People have been thinking about putting large mirrors in orbit around Mars by basically increasing the temperature on the surface, reflecting more sunlight to the surface. All kinds of large infrastructural projects. So this is basically what people think of as the 1,000-year project. So if you now look to the surface of Mars, it's really uninhabitable. But what could you do? Can you really create surface water? Can you create lakes again, like in the past? Early domes for gardens. Could you create a water cycle again on Mars? All kinds of research being done to see whether this is feasible or not. I don't think it will be happening soon, but it's something which is from a scientific point of view interesting to study, because you learn a lot about whole system and how a planet really reacts to certain kind of input and how it reacts. That's important. So there in the past, architects never looked at basically habitats in space or habitats on Mars, because it was not really something which was interesting. But these days, the last 10 years, you see a flurry of architectural firms looking into what it would take to create a nicely designed habitat in space. So this is a design from a company in New York, where they basically built a ice-like structure to save yourself from the radiation, but still leaving light coming through. And then inside this ice structure, you would have the actual habitat. And there are more designs being thought of by architects, and it becomes a kind of a hot topic at this moment. And it's not only being done for Mars, but people are also looking into the moon, but also looking into asteroids. This is my this is one of the ultimate dreams of Jared ONeil, the guy in the US in the 60s, who thought of the ONeil habitats, which is basically a large structure in space where you would create, which would rotate, generating 1g gravity, like on Earth, and many kilometers wide, well, giving people the ability to live in space, but still on a planetary-like structure. Far in the future, I think, but this is definitely something which attracts more and more interest from people here on Earth. So it's interesting to see. Another aspect which gained some traction, I think 5-6 years ago, is the idea of going to an asteroid, trying to find out what it's made of and extract the resources. So some of these asteroids, they consist of nickel, for many kilotons of nickel, but also more rare materials. So is this an idea which will develop in the next 10 years? I don't think so. In the next 50 years, definitely. If we see that more and more resources become rare on Earth, and we see that more and more things are happening in space, then 1 + 1 is 2. And this is something which might take tens of years before it's really going to happen. But in the end, it will definitely be done. Already now you have a company which is launching next week, I think, and they want to bring a propellant depot in space. It's still a small one, but what they want to do is, if you need propellant to go somewhere, you go to low Earth orbit, you basically refuel in low Earth orbit, you pay like at a gas station here on Earth, and then you can go further. So this is really already something which is happening. And then one of the things I think is really important is you always see the dichotomy between space exploration and taking care of our own Earth, and I don't see that dichotomy at all. I think it's you, when you go to space, you automatically are already interested in keeping Earth clean and keeping it safe, and that has to do with the fact that if you go to space, your resources are really tight, so you have to be really careful on how you do. Trash is not really trash. Trash is worth something. So you take care of it properly, and that all has an impact on how you behave on Earth as well. So ideally, what you want to do is, you don't want to have these coal plants here on Earth, or the gas-powered power plants. You don't want to have anything of that. You want to have structures in space which collect all the radiation from the sun as much as they can and send the power back as microwave beams to the Earth. So all the heavy equipment, all the polluting industries, they should be in space, and then bringing either energy back to the surface of the Earth, or full products so that the Earth does not become polluted. And that should be the main goal. And I think more and more people are starting to understand that space exploration and taking care of the Earth is something which goes hand into hand. And with that, I wanted to end my talk. Yes.
All right. Well, Arno, thank you for this nice talk that you gave us. I think it was really actually quite insightful. It is definitely interesting to see that Mars is not as simple as just, oh, let's go there, let's land there and see what happens. Mm-hmm. So I actually have a few questions for you. I think it's interesting to go a bit deeper into the topic. Sure. I think one of the questions that I want to ask is, well, of course you built your presentation in such a way that we can't ignore all the commercial launches that are happening right now. So we have SpaceX, we have possibly Blue Origin, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, do you think that Mars colonization should be also done by these, let's say, private corporations, or should it be more of a, let's say, common effort by agencies like ESA and NASA? So what's your opinion on that?
It's an excellent question. You know why Elon Musk started his own company to bring people to Mars? Because he saw that NASA and ESA were not doing the job. So, okay, you have someone who is really passionate about Mars exploration and Mars settlement, and he becomes really excited. And then nothing is happening. And to be honest, that was also one of the reasons why we started MarsOne. When I was a young boy, long time ago, the ESA told us that within 25 years we would be on the surface of Mars, and this is 1980. I'm not joking, I remember it. And 25 years later, in 2005, I still remember what they said. Yeah, within 25 years we will be on the surface of Mars. Well, that's not making it. So I fully understand that we don't want to have a corporate entity controlling everything on Mars. I understand that completely. But the way space agencies currently are being funded, the political influence on these space agencies, I personally don't see them being capable of doing it without the help of these commercial entities. Now, if you look carefully into how SpaceX is being funded, you will see that they basically survived due to a NASA contract. Otherwise, they would have already gone bankrupt in 2008. So it is already a public-private partnership. And I think that's how it should be. I think there should be good regulations in place to make sure that companies going to Mars do it in a way which is sustainable, not making profit over the backs of people doing the work there. So have it properly done. I completely agree with that. Ethics should be a major part of this. However, it should not be blocking it. I think and this is something which I hear too often, that humanity does not have the right to go to Mars, or we're already destroying our own planet. I hate these kind of comments because it's not constructive. You have to have an optimistic viewpoint, and I keep on having it, even though there are many problems we have to solve on Earth, and I agree with that. And it does not always goes into the right direction. We see that temperature is rising in the Arctic. We should do something about that, but then do something about this. We have the power as the population to do something about it by selecting the right people in government. And with that, it's the same story of going to Mars. Select the right people, give companies the money to do it, partly, but give them also some restrictions, give them guidelines, give them law on how they should behave. And then I think it will all be fine.
Okay. Oh. We actually have quite an interesting question that came in. So, we're talking about colonization of Mars, but colonization, implies sort of you're going to be there, right? So you're going to live there for an extended period of time, perhaps forever. So it's not out of the question that, people will sometimes or eventually have children on Mars. Could be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there any research that talks about what it would be like to have a child in space or another planet, or what the effects of that could be?
No. And I think it should be for the time being. So I personally think it's not ethically right to give birth at this moment. So if we would have sent we always said, if you go to send 4 people to Mars, please make them aware not to bear any children. Because what you do is you don't give a kid the option of going back. So you're basically putting them on Mars without having made their own choice. So this is something you could circumvent. Can you enforce it? No way. You have no control. So if people go to Mars, you can ask them politely not to do it. But in the end, they will decide themselves whether or not to do it. And there is some kind of an illusion sometimes that ground here on Earth, we would still control everything being done on Mars. But this is madness. You have absolutely no control, and you should not want it to. It should be done on a collaborative basis. You want people to do something on Mars, then you have to give something back to them. This is very simple. But I personally have a very strong opinion on people outside, of children being born outside space, not for the next 20 to 30 years. Absolutely not.
Okay. Oh, that's an interesting take, I think, for sure. And yeah, I think I have also one more question from me. So you know that right now NASA is planning this Artemis mission, and they say, well, we'll go to the moon and we'll, build a base there, and then we'll go to Mars. Whereas, of course, as you said, for Elon Musk, Mars was already kind of the goal, and yes, he will go to the moon, but Mars is still destination number one. So do you think it's worth for us to make that stop on the moon, or do you think we should, let's say, push on and get to the red planet as fast as we can?
Excellent question. Okay, I have to give a good answer to that. From a psychological point of view, it's better to go to the moon first. Not for the actual systems you need, because the actual systems you need to survive on Mars are completely different from what they will be on the moon. So when people tell you that the moon is a technology stepping stone for going to Mars, this is utter bullshit. It's not the case. If you want to go to Mars, you have to build the systems for Mars, not for the moon. Different gravity, no atmosphere, different, completely different. So, however, we have the politicians we have to talk to, because in the end, they will put a large amount of the money on the table. So there, to keep it into the psychological viewpoint of a politician, you go to the moon first. It's something we've done before. It's not that far out. If something goes wrong, look, it's very simple. If an astronaut dies during the time the politician has said that this mission should happen, his career is over. Very simple. So he needs to be able to bring people back in a heroic fashion to the Earth and make sure that they survive. So the moon is, from that respect, much better. If you ask me if this whole Artemis program is worth doing it, the non-political answer is no.
I think that's a controversial take.
It's utter madness. But that's my personal viewpoint. It's not the viewpoint of many people, but I think it's outrageous what's going on there. It's not a rocket developed to force any capability. It's a rocket because people needed to get the jobs, to maintain the jobs in the US. If that's the case, fine, if that's your main goal. But space exploration should go be a bit beyond. So I already have a lot of bets with people saying how many times Artemis will fly, and I don't think it will be that many.
Oh, all right. Well, I hope we'll see in the coming years what happens. So maybe you win the bet.
Yeah, and maybe I lose, because I must be honest. Most of the time, if I do a bet with any space-related topic, I most of the time lose. But that's fine. It always creates interesting discussions.
Yeah. And I think the last question for today that we have is, well, we also talked about terraforming Mars, and I think people have proposed different ideas about it. And I think one of the perhaps more fringe ideas were something like crashing asteroids into it, and I believe Musk even at some point said, "Oh, let's nuke Mars." So, what do you think about such extreme ways to terraform Mars? And should we settle before we start terraforming Mars, or should we terraform it first and settle later?
No, forget terraforming for the next 1,000 years. I don't. It's not necessary. First of all, it's not necessary. If you want to create a settlement on Mars. And secondly, I'm almost 90% sure when he said nuke Mars, he was joking, because he understands well enough what kind of impact such a feat would have on the surface. Look, everybody knows how Musk is. He smokes some pot and he goes on a podcast. Is it smart? No, I agree. Does he say things where I sometimes think, oh, please shut up? But that's the way the guy is. Sorry. He's got his bad things, but he also got quite some positive things from my point of view. And the nuking Mars was a joke. It was just a joke.
Okay. So, but nevertheless, still about terraforming. So I
Yeah.
guess terraforming is not, in your eyes, something that will really do. Okay.
Look, we first have to learn how to terraform Earth again.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're now doing an experiment on our own Earth, which is completely uncontrolled. So let's put that back in order before we start to think about terraforming another planet.
That's actually a very good point. And well, for now, sure, the last question, because it came in as we were discussing. How sustainable is the water and oxygen generation on Mars?
Well, that's not such a big deal. There's enough water to keep a large amount of people alive on the surface of Mars. Not only in the subsurface, but also in glaciers, which are covered around the equator on Mars. So there's a huge amount of water. So if you even put a 90% recycling effort next to it, you can sustain a large group of people on the surface for quite a long time. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's nice.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well.
And let's go a little beyond. Mars should not be the end point of this whole effort. We have a full solar system. It's for us. There's nobody else. Please, let's explore it properly. There is a nice movie being made by Erik Warnquist, which is called Wanderers. And each time when I watch that movie, I get this chicken skin on my arms, because he is able to capture the actual explorative spirit as it should be. So being able to fly in Titan's atmosphere, walk on the surface of Europa on the ice, look at Jupiter. That's what we should be doing. That's the actual explorative spirit we should get back and really bring people of all the place in our solar system. I can only see the benefits coming out of that. People creating new kinds of arts, new music. It will be an enrichment of humanity.
Well, I do like to see this positive attitude. I think it's actually really nice to also look forward to some, maybe utopia, Star Trek like, fast ships.
It's not utopian whatsoever, because we bring humans there, and humans have their own failings. So you will not get rid of that. So they will be the same. However, it does not make any sense to be not optimistic, because what does it help you to be not optimistic? It won't change anything. Being pessimistic won't change anything. So be optimistic. Try to see chances where you can do good, when you can make a difference. And that's what I'm trying to do with MarsOne. It failed utterly, but I don't care. I tried because I thought something was not happening, and we tried to do it. And we generated a huge amount of enthusiasm about the subject. And that enthusiasm is still there. So it's fine.
Yeah. Well, I think that on this actually really positive and motivating note, we can wrap up our stream for today. So Arno, once again, thanks a lot for coming on and taking the time out of your evening to come and talk to us about Mars space exploration and all these interesting topics. Thank you for answering our questions, and we hope that maybe in the future you're going to come and give a talk at our society once again, and maybe we will see you around.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. And for everyone watching, thank you all for being here as well. We really enjoy the fact that you tuned into our live stream on this Thursday evening. Stay tuned for more events and follow us on social media. Join our Discord server, and hopefully we will see you around for more events in the future. Thank you very much, and have a nice evening.